Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Configuring Mongo. This is the first video in the second section, and I'm glad you're still with us. At this stage, you should have a working installation for Mongo 3.2 installed on your system, and you should be able to connect to that system using the Mongo client. Now, I have a system here on my home network. I use this system in my development work, and all my databases go here because the system is super flush with memory and hard drive space. I have 3217 installed, and you can see that I've got nothing on it. So this database should be in exactly the same state as your database. It's the default database, just off a fresh install. There's no data in the system whatsoever. This is where you should be at right now. So the Mongo configuration file, and this is the documentation page for that configuration file, and this link and all the links that I'll refer to in this video will be available in the class notes. This web page talks about all the configuration file options, and it also talks about how you can change the configuration file options to adjust your operating environment for the Mongo database, or you can enter in these configuration file options at the command line and change the MongoDB configuration during runtime. I don't recommend you doing the latter unless there's something specifically you're testing and you're a power user with Mongo. It's much better to edit the configuration file, make your changes, save the file, and then test that way. Because if you start making a bunch of changes at the command line, you can lose track of all the changes that you entered. The configuration file gives you a means of recording those changes so you know that what works and what didn't work. The other thing we talked about was the Mongo Community Edition. That was the version that we installed during the installation videos. And there's actually two versions of the Mongo database available. One is the Community Edition, like I said, which we installed in the last version. And by Community Edition, what they're saying is that it's open source. If you have a GitHub account, or if you go to this link, again, in your class notes, you can find all of the source code for the Mongo database product that we installed. This is the GitHub page. And literally everything's on here. You can see that all the utilities and products that we downloaded and installed are available here as source code. So if this is your thing, you can download, you can fork, you can contribute, you can add to the Mongo software. And the other version of Mongo is the Enterprise Edition. And the reason why I'm bringing up the difference between these two versions of MongoDB is that some of the configuration file options are only available in the Enterprise Edition. I'll point those out when we encounter them. It probably won't be in this video, definitely be in the videos that follow. So, getting started, the Mongo configuration file lives in the etc directory. If I cd into the etc directory and I list anything with a Mongo name, I can see that the only thing I have in there is the mongod.conf file. Now, the configuration file as it was installed, in other words, the installation installed a plain vanilla configuration file. What I strongly recommend that you do, however, before you start editing this file, is to make a copy of it. And that way, if you do a little too much editing or something doesn't work the way you expected it and you need to revert, you have a copy of the original. So the first thing any good DevOps guy does before he starts banging on a config file is he makes a backup copy of it first, and that's what we're going to do right now. Whatever you want to call it is fine. I always name my configuration files with a .original extension, and that way I know which of these are the original configuration file, because as you see, as this course progresses, we're going to have many, many different config files. So it's important to give it a meaningful name so that 6 months or a year later, when we're coming back and we're looking at this, we don't have to scratch our head for too hard, for too long to try to figure out what these config files actually belong to. So in the configuration file, what we're going to be focused on today for this lesson is moving our database to a different physical location on a different hard disk drive. Remember when I talked about your root file system, you're going to install MongoDB into the root file system. And some of you may not be blessed with extremely large root file systems. As a matter of fact, for the installation video, I installed in probably one of the smallest file systems I've ever installed into. And I think I had less than a gigabyte of file system space left on the root partition after I was done installing MongoDB. Now, you may be looking at my root file system on this particular system and saying, but Mike, you've got 90% of your hard drive space free. You got 20 gigabytes. Is not big enough for a database? And yeah, sure, 20 gigabytes would be a huge database, especially for a home user or a developer. I have this other file system, which is mounted on my home directory, and I have almost 900 gigabytes of space free. And I want to move my data into this file system instead of keeping it in root for the simple reason that if something catastrophic happens to my root file system, I don't want to lose my data. In other words, if my solid state hard drive goes out and I have to replace it, or if the operating system somehow becomes corrupt and I have to reinstall, or I want to reinstall a different version of the operating system, say I want to move from Ubuntu to Cinnamon, then I can reinstall onto the root file system, reinstall the MongoDB, reconfigure the Mongo configuration file, and then when I start Mongo back up, all my data that I had under the previous operating system is still there. I haven't lost anything. And I usually follow that up with an off-disk backup. In other words, on my development systems, I have USB drives that I plug in, and I back up the entire home file system to the USB drive. So I always have a safe backup of my data that I'm working with, because in development, even as a developer, I'll start working with databases that have literally, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of rows. And it's incredibly difficult to reproduce those databases of that size. So the TLDR, or the too long didn't read version of what I just said, is move your data directories into the home file system, keeps them safe, keeps them separate from root, and you have a better chance of making a full recovery in case something catastrophic happens. So that's our point for today. We're going to move the default Mongo database from its current location, and let me show you where that is. The default database location for Mongo is in /var/lib/mongodb. And if I do a file listing, you're going to see a bunch of files on your screen. And these, again, are the plain vanilla files that came in with the installation. So the first thing I want to do to get ready for this installation is I want to stop the Mongo database. So Mongo is no longer running on my system. And the reason why we do this is when the MongoDB reads a configuration file, it only reads it once when it starts up. Therefore, whenever you make changes to the Mongo configuration file, you have to stop and restart the database every time. It's just easier to stop the database, make the changes to the configuration file, and then restart the service, the MongoDB service, using the system control command. But now our database is stopped. We've got a copy of our MongoDB conf file, and we're going to edit that. And here is the plain vanilla mongod.conf file, and you can see that points you to the documentation that I showed you. And the sections that we have in this configuration file, there's basically 3 for a plain vanilla first install, are the storage, the system log, and then our network configuration sections. All the other sections, let me move my cursor down, are blank. And as we progress in this class, we'll add more to these sections. For example, when we add user accounts or TLS encryption, we'll update the security section. When we create a replication, we'll add to the replication. When we create our shard, we'll add to the shard section. But for right now, we're going to be dealing primarily with the storage section. And as you can see from the comment, that's where and how we're going to store our data. In this section, there's a variable called db path. And the db path is the path name of where the database is located. It points to a particular folder. The other parameter, the journal, which by default is enabled, is your journaling subsystem for Mongo, and that allows you to do a recovery in case, the power goes off and you suddenly lose your Mongo installation, or you need to recover records that were recorded in the journaling process. The system log in the second section also allows you to change the location of the system log file. And this is kind of an important thing to consider, especially if your root file system isn't that big, because var log is in your root directory. It's okay for you to move the system log to another location. I usually do that when I'm developing. I move it into my /home/log directory for all the services that I'm developing for, and that way I have all my logs in one place and I don't have to go on an Easter egg hunt into various directories to find my log files. Another trick to save on file space is you can change the Boolean value for log append under the system log from a true to a false, and that means that every time that Mongo starts up, it will append, it won't append, it will create a new log file, and the old log file will be rotated similar to the Unix log rotate command. So you won't overwrite the previous log file. The previous log file will just be renamed, give it a generational name, like, mongodb.log.1, mongodb.log.2, whatever your log file name is. But the current running instance of MongoDB will always be written to whatever's specified in your path. The network interfaces section, denoted by the net, it has more parameters in this, but for right now what we're talking about is the port and the bind IP, and this is what Mongo is going to listen to for connection requests. So as you know, 127.0.01 is your machine IP, your host, your local host or home. That means Mongo's listening, running on that machine locally, and it's listening for connection requests on TCP port 27017. You can change this. You can change this port value to be any port that you want, as long as it's not a reserved port number. But just be aware that any client that wants to connect to your Mongo database has to be aware of the port change. As it stands, this is the default configuration, and this is where the clients will look by default for your instance of Mongo. Okay, so we're going to change the DB path, and I want to put it into my home data directory, which I already have created. So I'm going to change this file name to /home/data, and I'm going to keep the MongoDB name because it's self-describing. It means that my Mongo database is in the data directory in my home. And I'm going to write and save this file. Now, if I do an ls-l on /home/data, I don't have a MongoDB directory in there. I already have a data repository in there for my MySQL data. But we're going to copy the existing Mongo database files over to the new location. And the existing Mongo database files, as we talked about, are in /var/lib/MongoDB. And if I do a listing, we can see that I've got several files plus 2 directories, one for diagnostics and one for journaling. And indeed, if I do an ls-l on /journal, I can see that I have some WiredTiger logs in the journaling directory. Now the goal here is to copy all of this data over to the new location. And to do that, we're going to issue the following command. So I'm going to copy, and the -PVR options, -P tells the copy command to retain all the permissions. And this not only includes the file permissions, in other words, who can read, write, and have access to the file at what level, but also includes the owner and the group level permissions as well. The -V is for boast. In other words, for every file that gets copied, output that file to the screen. And the -R is for recursive. That means, as we saw in the journal directory, there's files underneath that subdirectory. We want to copy those as well. And as you can see, the copy is done, thankfully quick, because I'm working with just the default files in the database. And if I list those files, let's look at home data first. I can see I have my MongoDB directory. My file permissions have been maintained. In other words, MongoDB is owned by, the MongoDB directory is owned by the MongoDB user and the MongoDB group. So now that I've copied the files over, let's look at the existing files. The files that I copied look like this. The destination files pretty much look identical as you would expect them to. The file permissions are all maintained. The owner and group is the same. And if I look at even the journaling subdirectory, I can see that all of my data was copied over into home data MongoDB. So what I want to do now is, for proof of concept, I'm going to rename the MongoDB repository, or the directory where the old database files were being kept, into something else. So I'm going to do that by moving it. And now I can see that my MongoDB files have all been moved into a place called mongodb.original, which means that when I start up the MongoDB service, it has to look for the Mongo database that I specified in the configuration file, which should be my /home/data directory. And if it doesn't find those files, the database won't start up. And because I renamed the old Mongo database directory from varlib mongodb to varlib mongodb.original, it won't be able to find the original files either, because they don't exist anymore. So in other words, it can't find the original files, so it has to find the new files. If it can't find the new files, it won't start up. If it does start up, I know it found the new files because the old files no longer exist. Now, just before we start the database, I want to tell you, start it using the system control command. If you try to start it as root, the MongoDB application becomes owned by the root server, and there's initially a couple of wired tiger files that are created in that directory. And when root forks off the MongoDB process over to the MongoDB user, it can't access those files because it doesn't have permission to access those files that were created under the root account. So in other words, enter this command. You want to use system control space start space MongoDB. And we want to see if we started successfully. We're going to say status, and it says that Mongo is running, which is good. Let's look at the Mongo client. We're connected. Let's say show DBs. My database is there. So I've moved the database to a new directory. I've restarted Mongo, and I'm now successfully connecting to the new remote database. Okay, so that concludes this video. Let's just recap real quick. We took a working Mongo installation. We stopped the Mongo database server. We made a copy of the original MongoDB, the original Mongo configuration file that's in the etc directory, so we always have a copy of that. There's those files. We took the database files that were referenced by the original configuration file, and we backed those up into a location under varlib /mongodb.original, and we copied the original varlib mongodb directory into /home/data /mongodb. And now when we restarted MongoDB, it restarted successfully. It's now pointing to the new databases located on the other file system, and we successfully edited our configuration file and restarted the Mongo server to take advantage of the changes in those configuration files. If you're able to get that far, well done.